Hi, welcome everyone. It's so lovely to have you all join us. This is the last day of TALFF going on, so we can all just gather the last bits of energy that we have. We're going to wait for a few more minutes for folks to arrive and then get going. And then me and Nella will get dressed, find our weird hats for the party, and then head to Mekko afterwards. But yeah, feel free to grab some water, some tea, some coffee if you're an addict like I. Exactly. Brynhildur will go and get hers. Welcome, 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 everyone. By the way, we just have such a lovely session. I think there's a few people here that were at that session as well, but we had this lovely session with Kök, this Swedish collective, cooking potato salad together, talking about, I guess, doing some storytelling about food, about cooking together, potatoes, and this, let's say, different variations of the potato salad, both internationally, but it turns out that me and Nella also have some very basic differences about what constitutes a good potato salad. Yeah, so I'm sad you missed that, but perhaps next year you'll have the opportunity to join us as well. Lovely. I'm so grateful that folks still have a little bit of energy to join this closing presentation and discussion. And actually, I think it might be a good idea until we get going to perhaps open a window in your room, and I'll just make sure with Nilla if it's okay here as well. Yeah, just so we could get some air. There's something about slight discomfort in the body that really awakens all of your senses, and cold is that for me. Yes. Is it just 2 cups of coffee? I really hope so. 2
cups of coffee. I'm making sure that I'm not going to run out during the next 19 minutes.
My friends call that double fisting.
Okay. You're live.
Yes, exactly.
Good point, Nele. Let's get us uncomfortable.
I bring the discomfort, you bring the attention.
Fantastic. All right, so you just let me know when I should begin by introducing myself, and nice. I will mute myself until then, and I don't know, check my emails.
Beautiful.
Yes. I will now actually take over for Sanna to welcome everyone also from the Feministerium office one last time during this Feminist Forum. That has been different and awesome, and I've been sitting the whole week too much, so now I'm standing in our kitchen from our kitchen session, and yes, I'm really happy that Brynhildur is here with us today. You have been a real joy of a new contact that we have found in you and the Icelandic Women's Organization in Feministerium. And yes, as Sanna said, we are happy to have this last session now and to start thinking about the evening. Last talk actually that we'll have also physically in Mekko and later on a bit the dance. So I will be in the background now, so if anyone has any technical questions, they can write to me. Just a heads up that maybe you have already seen, we are streaming also on Facebook. We will record this as well, so you can watch it later and share it if you think that this is awesome to share to your friends as well. And yeah, feel free to have your camera on or off as you wish. And I will let Sanna and Brynhildur to kind of share how they feel most comfortable about how to do if you have any questions or comments. So I'll give it to you now, Sanna.
Thank you. So my name is Sanna. I am the moderator for this discussion and a few other that happened during the forum beforehand. And before we get started, I just like to both kind of get into the body a little bit before we move on to onto the brain, because that is absolutely a valid dualism, right? So the first thing that I would like you all to do is to write into the chat how you're feeling in 2 words. How would you answer the question, how are you doing? 2 words. Let's just kind of get grounded and see where we are emotionally and physically and intellectually. I'll give you a minute for that. Nice. Is today Guy Fawkes Day? I believe that it might be. Remember the 5th of November. If you've seen V for Vendetta or read it, then you know what I'm talking about, or just are culturally aware without pop culture having to have something to do with it necessarily. Lovely. I think we have a lot of answers in. Feel free to keep them coming. But in order to combat this, or let's say both to channel the excitement that I see in the comments here, and both to deal and sit with the stress and exhaustion that a lot of us are also in the space here with, I would just like to move through a few things physically with me. Yeah, so if you would feel more comfortable to have your camera off, then feel free to turn it off for a little bit. I like to make a fool of myself, so I'll keep mine on. And the first thing that I would like you all to do is just to move your head tilted to the left and to the right slowly. And kind of take in a few nice breaths as you do it. And now you can just do half circles in the back like this and keep on breathing. And this is all you have to do right now. No other obligations, no other expectations. Breathe into the tension that I'm sure you might have at the back of your head here. And now come to the frontal, or come to the center for a moment. Take a breath. Exhale. Let's do it in the front a little bit as well. These half circles, slowly, slowly. We are embodied human beings, and our bodies like to have a little bit of attention paid to them. Slow and deep breaths as well. Some cracks if you're like me. Awesome. Feel free to come back to the center. Shake your head a little bit. Now lift up your arms like this, and just try to pick apples that are high, really, really high on one ceiling with one hand, and then pick another apple really high. And you can just drop them down a little bit like this as well. Oh, one apple, another apple, or maybe there's something else that's in season where you are right now. Take deep breaths into your sides a little bit here. Nice. And now with both of your arms up here, if you can, or maybe there's somewhere here, maybe that's more comfortable for you. And now you can just slowly release them. Nice, shake your shoulders. And last little bit. No one needs to see you properly, but get up for a moment. And just jump up and down and shake your body a little bit. Properly. Oh yes. Okay. The body's getting attention and love and is feeling so seen. Okay, we can have a little seat. Take another deep breath. I'm just also gonna hug one knee and the other, but the point is just to grab some part of your body. Maybe it's the arm, or maybe it's the knee. Put your hands on it and just say, I love that part. And I will in Estonian say, ma armastan sind. Okay, so some of that seriousness that we might have had arriving to the session has hopefully dissipated. These conversations that we have during TALFF are not only about knowing more, but also activating those parts of ourselves that are willing and able to engage. And oftentimes participation, oftentimes action requires let's say, flirting with the possibility of making a fool of ourselves. And oftentimes that willingness to fail and that willingness to play around the margins of failure, you know, it requires us to be less serious. I think that also makes the potential revolution a little more fun. With that being said, thank you for being along with this journey with me. Brynhildur, and whose pronunciation in Icelandic, I think I rocked when we had a little preliminary meeting, will be giving us a wonderful deep overview of how Iceland got to be where they are. We had a beautiful session on Wednesday, also with two Icelandic representatives of a local organization called the Feminist Movement, if I'm not mistaken, a gender budgeting group there. And we got a close overview of how relatively well, comparatively to other countries, women, non-binary people, and just general gender politics are in Iceland. There's, of course, a long way to go, and I'm sure Brynhildur will give us a little bit of insight into there. As we go through this presentation and through this, let's say, learning experience, see if you can keep that childish / curious / wondering / opportunity seeing part of your brain alert and open. Brynhildur will be really excited to receive questions and comments as we get into the discussion side of things. So when something, you know, has a red or a blue or a green flag pop up in your head, then write that down in your paper so it wouldn't get lost, so we can have a nice, fruitful, exciting conversation. And I think there's something else that I wanted to add before we kick off. Yes, as said, this is the last face-to-face intellectual meeting that we'll have in, let's say, in that entire forum plan. So I'm excited to hand it over to Brynhildur so that the understanding of what doing feminism means realistically can mean both in the case of Iceland and in the case of Estonia and other countries in the universe. So thank you. Over to you, Brynhildur. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanna. I really, Sanna, I want to have you as a moderator for all my Zoom meetings before that, because that was amazing to have a Zoom yoga before I start, because, you know, I'm feeling very loose and limber and so eager to speak with you. As Sanna said, I wanted to wanted to give a little bit of a talk about sort of like feminist organizing in Iceland and how we got to where we are today. And I also wanted to sort of like bring in also in a bit of a practical viewpoint, sort of like, you know, when we got sort of like, you know, to talk about sort of like what are the specific tools and legislation that we have passed, which I feel confident is sort of like the reason also sort of like those, so those are sort of like, you know, the sort of like building blocks of sort of like making sure that equality is maintained. But the focus of my talk will be sort of like that the feminist organizing is absolutely the ground, the foundation of all these legislations. Like without organizing the organization of the women's movement and the feminist movement, nothing would have happened. And it's also so fantastic to be with you here at the Tallinn Forum, because this is basically the heart of organizing. We have that to organize a forum where to bring together different groups of people, different groups of feminists who are working each in their own corner, and to share their experiences and to learn from each other, and also to sort of like, you know, and to create something new via dialogue. That this is sort of like this solidarity and this consensus, and I'm not going to say consensus, but this cooperation and finding a ground where we can all agree on is sort of like the build, sort of like what has driven us in Iceland and our organization, our organization of the movement as a whole. I'm going to attempt to share some slides to walk us through this. Share screen, there we go. Share. Does this all work? Are you seeing?
Yes, yes.
So you're seeing my tiny face and sort of like a huge slideshow. Fantastic, because I can, all right.
So at the moment, we actually don't see the slideshow, we see your desktop. So maybe I think another...
Stop here, wait, hang on. Thankfully, there's nothing embarrassing here. Wait, hang on, let's try it again. Share. What about now?
Let's see. Beautiful, we're there.
This works?
Yes.
Okay, do you see me as well, or is it just the screen?
Oh, we see you as well.
Yay! All right, I like the picture.
You are being
It's always nice
seen.
to have a friendly face to the talk. And so I basically titled my talk "Organizing for Solidarity: The Feminist Movement in Iceland." So what I want to do is just to go over, because those of you who attended the talk on Wednesday with Feminist Fjármál will know sort of like we have come pretty far, and the only reason we've come so far is because of this just countless of women who have worked for over a century in Iceland to sort of like organize for change and sort of like have pushed through the changes necessary, and sort of like and I want to put it into like a political perspective. So I mean, I usually sort of like when I talk about where we are in Iceland, and this is basically what people know about Iceland, that we've topped the global gender gap index in 2021. We've done so, I think, for the last 12-13 years. That's sort of like we've been at the top. However, sort of like I always want to sort of like use these numbers with sort of like caution, because I mean, I think sort of like in the end, what these numbers show us is that sort of like even the country that this organization considers to be doing the best, we're not equal at all. Sort of like, so according to this index, we reached 89.2% equality, which of course is not equality at all. It's inequality. That means that we haven't gone too far. And also what these numbers figures, I mean, these numbers, the Global Gender Gap Index is a useful indicator, sort of like, but it's just that it's useful. It doesn't tell the whole truth. So for example, when you think about numbers like the Global Gender Gap Index, what they don't do is that, for example, they have a section on women and health, but they don't have reproductive health and reproductive rights within those figures. So they don't look at those. And as we know, reproductive rights are sort of like the essence of women's healthcare. And if women don't have bodily autonomy and sexual autonomy, it's really hard, I'm going to say impossible, to guarantee women's rights and gender equality within a society. And they don't address that. They don't address women and violence against women in the Global Gender Gap Index report. I mean, I will tell you, if women and violence was a part of this, we would collapse sort of like in the rankings, because violence against women is endemic here in Iceland, as it is in the rest of the world. And sort of like if we add problematic figures, and that we were talking about how we problematize the stories of success stories, this is a problem. Like we have a very long way to go to reach equality. That being said, beginning by problematizing, I'm going to tell you sort of like, you know, how we got to at least where we are today. And it begins and sort of like, I think the heart of my talk is sort of like in the end politics. It's I've been involved in the feminist work since I was in high school. So for 25 years, I've been, you know, a participant in one group or another. And for the past 10 years, I've worked for the Icelandic Women's Rights Association, and actually getting paid for my activist work. And sort of like through this wow, quarter century, oh my God, I'm old. For this quarter century, I've come to sort of like just this personal realization that sort of like where we are today all hinges on the fact that women are active in politics, and that sort of like political participation is absolute key to getting everything else done. I'm just going to say this and state this outright, that if you don't have women in politics, and if you don't have feminist women in politics, or, you know, feminist people in politics enacting sort of like the legislation that sort of like that both create rights and guarantee rights, we're not going to get very far, or we're not going to get anywhere in generating gender equality. So we start sort of like, I start the story of sort of like where we of Icelandic women's movement in 1907. That was actually the year our organization was founded. The Icelandic Women's Rights Association was founded then. It's a it's, you know, our organization is a part of what we sometimes call the first wave, the original women's rights defenders, the suffragettes who were fighting for women's suffrage, and we were one of those. And so, but our organization very early on recognized that sort of like, yes, it's very useful to have an NGO, but, you know, to get real power, you need to become politically active. So what they did is that in 1907, women received a limited right to vote, so not on a national basis, but in local elections in Reykjavik. So so if you see the lady there to the left in the bottom left corner, that's Brynhildur Heiðar, and she was the founder of our organization. So, and she basically said, oh, you know, she said sort of like women need to be running for local government here in Reykjavik, and she created like a women's only list, and they basically ran for office in the city council of Reykjavik. And it's actually such a fantastic story because it also sort of like tells you how when a small group of determined women who are willing to organize, who are organized, they can just change the world. Basically what she and sort of like the other women did was that they went and knocked on every door in Reykjavik, and they talked to all the new voters. So obviously sort of like the political parties in Reykjavik had been running for elections for decades at that point. And, you know, and you know, the voters were always male, and so they didn't really think that there was going to be any difference in 1907, that sort of like suddenly all the women in Reykjavik also had the right to vote. So it turns out sort of like the only people talking to the women at the time were sort of like this new party, this women's list that knocked on the door and talked to all the new voters, the women, told them sort of like that they were running for office and what they wanted to do, and also very importantly educated them about how it is, like, how do you vote in an election, like what happens, like do you go and sort of like, you know, encourage them to go vote. And they won a huge victory. They got all 4 women and the party elected into city council, and, you know, got the largest part of the vote in Reykjavik. And sort of like, so it showed sort of like, and I think sort of like it set the tone in Iceland, that this huge victory in 1907, it kind of set the tone for the rest of the century. Is that sort of like when women are organized and when women run for office and run for power, they can achieve it. And so it began a century where, you know, periodically women sort of like would become fed up and sort of like run for office as a part of women's only lists. So women didn't really receive the right to vote in national elections until 1915. And the first woman was elected to Alþingi, Ingibjörg Bjarnason, in 1922. She was also elected, by the way, from a women's only list, right? Because traditional parties, male parties, would not, you know, didn't really want women to be running for office. And here we go. So like, so it began, so the century began with a bang, but, you know, it didn't really, it stopped there, right? Like, so for 50 years, 60 years, you know, obviously we know what was going on. You know, we had 2 world wars, we had a Great Depression, and then we had sort of like the 50s where we had like a global or like a Western pushback where women were being pushed back into the homes. So this happened also in Iceland. There was just, you know, nothing happening. And so in 1971, for the first time, we saw sort of like 3 women elected to Alþingi. And you can imagine, right? Like it's more than half a century that women have had the right to vote and run for office. But between 1915 and 1971, you either had, you know, 1 woman in parliament, 2 women in parliament, or 0 women in parliament. So it's only in 71 that it suddenly got like, oh my God, we've got 3. And at that time, just also to put it into perspective, Iceland was really backwards in gender equality in the context of Northern Europe. So our cousins in the other Nordic countries at the time were already, you know, reaching 20% representation of women. It is us who were sort of like, you know, lagging behind with, you know, 5% representation. And so yeah, and here in 1980, the woman is first elected president, Vigdís Finnbogadóttir. It's a fluke, really, I think. But in 1980, we still had, like, you know, one really important thing that happened by 1980, and that is that I was born. I was actually born at that time. I was 2 years old, and we still only had 3 women in parliament. So I'm a young woman, and I was born when I was born when, you know, we had 5% representation of women in parliament. We didn't have anything like, you know, equal pay, you know, equal parental leave, or, you know, we didn't have parental leave really. We didn't have daycare, sort of like, so all the things that sort of like we are now considered sort of like the cornerstone of where we are as a society today, it didn't exist when I was born. And, you know, and it wasn't until I was 5 years old. I'm sorry, I'm sort of like putting everything sort of like about me, sort of like, you know, where I was now. But so it's when I was 5 years old, women finally got fed up, and they sort of like and they decided to sort of like create a women's list again. So, and they looked back to 1907 and saw the success of what had been going on there, and they said, enough is enough. We aren't getting anywhere in sort of like within traditional parties. We're going to create our own list, and we're going to run for parliament. And they won. They got, I think, 4 or 5 women elected into parliament. But also, what is perhaps equally and even more important is that they sort of like made the spurred change within the more established parties, that they realized that they could no longer ignore to women within the work. But for the sheer fact that they were actually running for office, other parties began to sort of like, you know, to let women run for office sort of like at the top of their lists as well. So overnight we went from 5% representation to 15% representation. So then that happened incredibly swiftly. And I think because what we're talking about, sort of like what you've been talking about for the past week, is organizing for solidarity, is to focus on the fact that sort of like this organizing, this political organizing, it doesn't arise out of a vacuum. It arises actually from organizing such as you are doing. It arises from the organization of the feminist movement in Iceland. So obviously, what had been going on in the 70s was that you had second wave coming to Iceland. So you saw sort of like this sheer resurgence of feminist activism, all these groups being founded that are working on women's rights and sort of like, you know, and gender equality. And one huge event happened in 1975, and I think I forgot to put it on the slides, but in 1975, all these groups came together and they organized a huge women's strike in Iceland. So in October in 1975, 90% of women left their work basically for one day to protest the income pay gap, or like the gender inequality in Iceland. And a huge like a huge protest like that doesn't come out of nowhere. It actually took a year to organize that strike, and it took every single women's group in Iceland, not only the sort of like more radical feminist groups, but also the more established like women's societies and the charitable societies and knitting societies, also the professional societies. Like every single women's group was sort of like involved in organizing the strike, making sure that women across the country knew what was going on and that they would be willing to participate, and sort of like translating the idea into sort of like, you know, a mandate, or like, you know, and through this organizing, you saw sort of like number one, very important, all these women were learning how to organize something huge like this. It's important, sort of like, it, you know, organizing takes, you know, it's a skill. You need to sort of like learn how to do this, and you need to be practice. So all these women were getting sort of like training and becoming sort of like these fantastic organizers for change. And also number two, equally important, they were getting to know each other, right? Like they were meeting other women who were willing, who were passionate about women's rights and passionate about change and passionate about politics. And the Women's Alliance, they sprung from that work. So these are all women that were getting to know each other, like in planning the women's strikes and the other actions of the 70s. So absolutely creating the groundwork for moving those protests from the sort of like NGO level, from the outset level, and becoming sort of like infiltrating the mainstream and becoming the mainstream. Now we're 2009. So here we are. So 2009. So after 1983, women started to slowly rise in parliament in Iceland, but, you know, very, very slowly. And, you know, you know, we went from 15 to 18 to 20 to 22, right? Like, but we never really broke the glass ceiling, right? Like, it's sort of like it seemed to stop at around 30%. Like, it seemed to be very comfortable for society that sort of like, you know, women should be 30% of the ruling class, and or like the people making decisions, and men should be 70%. And that all changed in 2009 when women broke the glass ceiling in Helsinki, and we went overnight from 29% to 43% representation. And you can see here like the huge protests that erupted in Reykjavik because of women infiltrating the power, the center of power. Okay, I can't hear you laughing, but then I can't actually see your faces, but I assume you're laughing because that was totally a joke. But because what's actually going on here, obviously, as you can see the date, 2009, these are huge protests because of the financial crisis, right? What happened in Iceland, I think everyone knows, it was catastrophic in Iceland. We saw the bankruptcy of the whole banking system here in Iceland, and lots of people lost their savings. Lots of people lost their jobs. Many people lost their homes, and obviously there were huge protests. Obviously the government collapsed. Obviously we had to have a new vote for parliament. And you know what? Turns out when people were voting as a protest vote, they were not thinking about gender equality. They just wanted something new. And what happened was that they voted for women, because it turns out, and actually sort of like later on when we went back and looked at what had been going on and all the decisions that had been made in the decade before the financial crisis, and all the people who were in positions of decision making within the financial sector, turns out these were all men. Like, women were not participating in this, like they had no voice. And so the public in Iceland, they voted, you know, this was a financial vote in 2009, and they voted for women. And, you know, we haven't really gone down much since then. We never gone down below the glass ceiling right now. And we had an election last month. They're actually still debating sort of like what happened with the election. We're either at 47% or 53%. It depends on sort of like there's still actually lawsuits going on the election. So we might actually be achieving majority, but then again, we might not. You know, we'll see what happens. It's the patriarchy, don't you know? All right, where are we? Oh, yeah, 2009. This is also very important. This is what happens in 2009. People wanted something new. They voted, like Jóhanna Sigurðardóttir became the first prime minister, like woman who served as prime minister in Iceland. And she's important. She's an important figure in many ways. She's also the first LGBTQ plus person to be a prime minister in Iceland, and I think actually in the world. And she's also sort of like a figure that sort of expands the history of Iceland, because she's also one of the she was then the only woman who was left in parliament who was actually a part of, like, you know, who had experienced being only one of 3 women. Like, and it's sort of like, you can imagine sort of like the effect it has on a woman, sort of like when you come into a center of power and you're one of only 5% of women making decisions, and then she ends up as prime minister. So she's actually a very fascinating and fantastic figure, woman. Yeah, and sort of like, and the reason I'm focusing so much on politics is because I'm just so interested in sort of like, you know, the underpinnings of our society, sort of like that we as feminists are working within a system, and we often talk about patriarchy as a theoretical construct, but it really isn't. It's because we live in a society that is based on the rule of law. It's based on our constitution. It's based on all the laws that have been made by our parliaments. It's based on all the contracts and conventions that have been written by sort of like an international agreements that have been written by the international community. It's based on all the judgments that sort of like our court system has been making, not only today, but for a century, for more than a century in most countries. And so here I put this just to sort of like put this into a figure, sort of like, so you can see this graphically. This is the number of women who were represented in the Icelandic parliament since 1916, the first time, sort of like first election where women were allowed to vote, that no woman was elected. So and just you see this blue sea there, like this. These are sort of like, this is the number and sheer number of men and the time that they were making decisions for us, that they were creating the laws that sort of like actually generate sort of like and create the society that we live within, that create the framework that we have to manipulate in. So, for example, our penal code in Iceland was written, I don't know if you see my cursor, but sort of like it's hovering here around 1944. That's when our penal code was written. And that's, when 2 women were in parliament. Sort of like, you can imagine that sort of like the penal code that sort of like is still sort of like being used with amendments, obviously, but the underpinnings are like come from a very different time where like very different people were making decisions and when women had no part in it. And it's so, and you can also see sort of like, and this is also a reason when we look at sort of like where we are today as a society in Iceland, it really has very little to do with what was going on in Iceland in the 20th century. Sort of like, at that time, sort of like, yes, women are organizing and they're talking together through NGOs, they're focusing on charitable work, but they do not have any real power. Like they are not a part of the decision-making community. And so when you look at the laws that sort of like are being passed, that sort of like fundamentally affect women's rights and increase gender equality in Iceland, you can see that sort of like before we broke the glass ceiling in Iceland, there are very, very few legislation that is being proposed and passed. So like we have, sure, 1911, we didn't talk like equal access to education, and then, women's right to vote, yes, basic. But then sort of like you see, the first Equal Pay Act was, only passed in 1961. It was, 75, you had, right to abortion added by law, and, 76, first Comprehensive Gender Equality Act. Like first maternity leave, that was after I was born. My mother didn't get maternity leave. So like, so that was 1980. 1990, it wasn't until 1995 that sort of like gender equality was actually added to the Constitution as that sort of like discrimination based on gender became illegal, and it was only added because of the members of the Women's Alliance, which were still in Parliament, advocated for it and fought that to have it added. 2000, you see equal parental leave, and then 2008, right before the financial collapse, you have an updated Gender Equality Act. So if we look at like this spans, like these acts span over a century, and like there are about 10 of them. So we can say like there's maybe one act per decade. That's sort of like, this is the importance that's placed on gender equality in a parliament that is male, where women have no voice. But so what happens, sort of like, but then look, if we look back, sort of like, so what happens, starting in 2009, once women start to have, once women have not true equality, like we still haven't equal representation, but we are approaching it. We break the glass ceiling and we're about 40%. So what happens then? These are acts that have been passed for the past 10 years, for the past 12 years since we broke the glass ceiling. And you can just see the preponderance, or like, because it really means that sort of like a gender equal parliament, the parliament where you have women and where you have feminists, they work differently. Different items get put on the agenda and things start to move very quickly, as it has happened here in Iceland. Things start, where we are today is something that's almost still surprising to us because it has happened so quickly. 2009, we see pimping and purchase of prostitution is banned. 2010, we see the first gender quota legislation for companies. 2010, we see an act saying employers can no longer profit from the nudity of their employees. It's basically a regulation that basically bans strip clubs. So in Iceland, for example, if I wanted to strip for somebody and get paid for it, I could, so long as I was doing it myself and getting all the money. But if somebody else wanted to get the money by having me strip, they could not do that. So that's sort of like what the regulation means. 2010, you have a gender neutral marriage act. That's basically marriage for everyone, for LGBTQ people. 2011, police are finally given authority to remove domestic violence offenders from the home. 2012, first law guaranteeing the right of trans people. Same year, you have the equal pay standard being introduced on a voluntary basis. 2015, law that requires government budget to be gender sensitive, like the budget needs to be read over to make sure that it affects the genders equally. 2018, equal pay standard is made mandatory. 2018, we have consent-based legislation passed. 2019, laws liberalizing abortion. 2019, a fantastic law guaranteeing gender autonomy, trans and non-binary. 2019, equality matters to are transferred to the Prime Ministry. 2019, you have the first MeToo law being passed on violence in sports and youth centers. 2020, equal parental leave, 6 months, completely equal is being passed. 2020, you have a comprehensive equality legislation being passed that includes 3 genders, women, men, and neutral. 2020, laws on stalking. 2020, laws on online violence. 2021, first action plan on re-evaluating women's work in the labor market. You just see this list, you go like, wow. And so and all this just wasn't there, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, before women broke the glass ceiling. So it really matters. It does matter who it is who is making the decisions for us, who is actually putting items on the agenda and making and saying that this is important, we need to talk about this. And so this is why I sometimes joke that I had an epiphany in 2009. In 2009, I was, I'm a trained literary critic, so I would, often call myself as, I'm a post-feminist, I'm a postmodern feminist, ironic feminist. I focused on women's representation in the media and was a bit hands off. And then we had the election of 2009, and I woke up and I realized, wait, what? We broke the glass ceiling, and it was at that point I felt this sheer sense of euphoria, because I didn't recognize and realize how much this meant to me. And I sometimes think perhaps it was because I hadn't allowed myself to think that big. I focused on women in the media and women's representation and beauty standards because at that time I could not even conceive that we would ever break the glass ceiling, because it just never had been done, and there was just no effort to have to break the ceiling. And I sometimes joke that that was the moment I became a power hungry feminist. I realized, oh my God, we got the power. What are we going to do with it? And and if we look back at the last 12 years, we've been doing a lot with it. So I'm incredibly happy about that. So I'm just going now to go very quickly over it, some of the sorry, where are we? There we go. I can't actually use the oh, there we go. Yeah, so I'm just going to go over just very quickly because I know that this is not what you're mostly interested in. We want to talk about feminist organizing, and I really want to have a discussion with you now after this, about feminist organizing and how we go about it and how we how we can affect change. But I think it's important just to have I've taken it together just a quick overview of some of the basic tools that I feel have been absolutely fundamental in creating the society that we live in today. And these are the tools that are being passed mostly by by a gender equal parliament. So okay, I added this slide here. Just so you know, we got to where we are now. Gender quotas are not mandated in elections, by the way, in Iceland. We now have 8 parties in parliament. 4 of them have set their own internal rules to guarantee equal representations. 4 have no rules to guarantee equal representations. It is the opinion, and it is stated, we've actually been advocating for this in the Icelandic Women's Rights Association, and it is our stated opinion that we want to see this actually passed into our voting legislation. We look at the changes that have been happening to our society in the past 12 years. We recognize these changes are made because of women's representation in parliament. So we want to make sure that women's representation never drops. So we want to actually have this put into the voting laws. And this really matters because, okay, I'm going back again. If you look here in 2017, that's the the election before this election this year. You see a huge drop of women. Women were 48%, and they dropped down to 38%. Why? It's because of parties that were running for office that didn't have any sort of rules to guarantee women's representation. And those parties in 2017 won big, which meant that suddenly you had a whole lot of new men coming into parliament and not a lot of women. So it's it was a reminder, I think, to all of us in the feminist, and not only the feminist community, but to all of us in Iceland, that progress is not inevitable, that there can always be a backlash. And it also emphasized the importance of rules, to avoid a huge drop of 10% like this. Again, we will need to set some rules to make sure that every party that's running for office has some sort of regulations or rules to ensure the equal representation of women. And in fact, sort of like we now have a fairly equal parliament, and the only reason for that is that the parties who don't have any rules, they nevertheless felt the social pressure to actually make sure that women were equally represented and in the top seats of their lists. But you know, I'm a very practical feminist. I want to sort of like just, you know what, let's just put it into law, you know, problem solved. I just want to sort of like set it in stone so we can never have another, you know, backlash. Yeah, but so to the tools. Where are we? Gender quotas in governmental committees. This is I mean, just fairly basic. It basically says that sort of like if in a governmental committee, whether it's a national government or the local government, you need to have equal representation of or like women cannot be below 40%. And we updated and now since 2020, it basically also said that sort of like gender people who have gender neutral you know, designation should also be encouraged to apply, but they're not a part of the quota. It sort of like basically just says that the ratio of women shall never go below 40% in those committees. Here we have the oldest law from 2009. This is the first gender quota law. It basically says that women should not be lower than 40% in the board of companies with 50 or more employees. It actually sort of like I look at this law now and I see it as outdated, and we're actually fighting to have it changed because it was the first of its kind here in Iceland, and it set the bar at 50 employees or more. But any of the other legislations that deal with gender equality at this point and since then have set the bar at 25 employees. So we want to actually update the law to make sure sort of like the gender quota also applies to companies with 25 or more employees, because we do see that there is a huge differences in whether a company is mandated by law to have a gender quota or not. And sort of like, and this is one of the big areas where we have not achieved sort of like you know, a good representation of women, and that's in the private sector. So we see companies that, you know, with 50 or more employees, they now have you know, 36% representation of women. So you definitely have companies breaking the law, but you know, women are there now up to 36%. But up as a whole in the private sector, women in boards of companies are only about 25%. So we see that the companies who are not subject to this law, they're choosing men. Sort of like it's not happening on its own. So again, for me, that sort of like also underscores the necessity, sort of like, you know, if we want to create a gender equal country, we do this by legislation. Again, I perhaps referred to my earlier comment that I've become a very power hungry feminist. I quote legislation all the time. Yeah, oh, there we go. See, 30, this is 2019. Yeah, 34. It's actually now up to 36. Yeah, so it's up to 36 now in the last figure. Sorry, I forgot to update this. And so, but you see sort of like the effect that the real effect that it had by passing the law. So so it went from 15 to 35. So it like legislation has effects. That's why we create legislation. We want to create the ground rules for our society, and it's just like a matter of what kind of society does our parliament, you know, want to create, and it really depends on the parliament. Yeah. Corporate, this is women in boards of all companies. Yeah, see, 26%. So it makes a difference. This is also a part of like our equal gender equality legislation. We basically say that all companies and institutions with 25 or more employees, they need to set themselves a gender equality plan. And I think sort of like this is a very important sort of like an under sort of like discussed part of our gender equality legislation, because, you know, in effect what it means is that it is sort of like requiring companies to hire feminists, right, to hire people with like knowledge of gender equality to actually write this gender equality plan. So I also sometimes joke that sort of like Iceland is one of the few countries in the world where you actually go take a gender studies course at the university, or like, you know, take a gender studies degree, and it actually increases your chances of getting an employment. And the reason why is because of legislation like this that sort of like says that this knowledge is now important, it's valuable. Sort of like companies do need to fulfill certain obligations on equality in the job market. And sort of like you need people who have an understanding of gender equality to actually do that work. So this is actually a very cool sort of like part of our legislation. This is also the corporate responsibility. These organizations are like, you know, required to think about to encourage men to go home and take care of children. They're encouraged to, or like required to find ways of helping their workers maintain a family life balance. So it's absolutely sort of like important that sort of like we have these restraints on the job market. I'm not going to go deeply into this because this is a very technical discussion. It's just this is also what we place on the corporate responsibility, and I think it's just so amazing. It's we have something in Iceland called the equal pay standard, and it's a standard that was created here in Iceland to basically measure income inequality within a company. So it's basically a payroll. It's basically sort of like a standard where a company sort of like, it begins by a company evaluating all the jobs that are being performed within that company and for the company, and placing a value on the job, like how valuable is this job to us as a company. And then sort of like once the evaluations have been done, they sort of like look at the people who are doing the job at this moment, sort of like, and they will see and what pay that person is getting. And you can very quickly pinpoint where there are areas of inequality. So for example, why is this a person who is doing a job that is being valued like this being paid, you know, like half the salary? And, you know, so you can pinpoint areas of inequalities, and it's most often women, but it can also pinpoint inequalities, for example, if workers, immigrant workers, or workers who are handicapped are being paid less. And it basically sort of like gives companies this tool to sort of like correct these inequalities. And it was introduced in 2012 here in Iceland on a voluntary basis. Companies were, you know, encouraged to implement it, but, you know, but in 2017, like, you know, we had moved that far in the conversation that the parliament or the government at the time decided to sort of like propose the law and got it passed that all companies with 25 or more employees are mandated to institute it. And they said, and I obviously so agree, they said that we as a society, we have all these laws in place that put these duties on companies. So for example, we have like laws on workplace safety. A company needs to be able to guarantee workplace safety. Why are we not then requiring companies also to guarantee that they're not breaking discrimination law by discriminating against people in pay? And so they got it passed, and sort of like now all companies with 25 more employees need to sort of like to pass this to get an equal pay certification once every 3 years. And so what's so amazing about this standard is that it shifts the conversation and it shifts the blame away from the individual onto the company itself. So we've had, as I told you earlier, we had, you know, our first equal pay legislation was passed in 61, then again in 76, and then we again in 2008. And, you know, again today in 2020, sort of like, so we see this continual passing and updating of the law that's supposed to ban pay discrimination based on gender, yet the gender pay gap still exists. And so there's something deeply wrong within our work market. And what has usually happened is that in the rest of the world, and in Iceland before we got the equal pay standard, what usually happens, like when a person encountered pay discrimination, when a person found out that they were being discriminated against in the labor market, that they got less pay than the man working next to them, what usually happened was that, like, we put the responsibility on the worker itself, herself. That so she would basically have to, you know, number one, find the you know, psychological resources to sort of like, you know, the strength to actually go and do something about it, to go to the company and complain. So, and she needed the social support. Like, does she have enough sort of like people around her to support her in her complaint? She needed financial support. Like, if the matter went up before the courts, did she have enough money to pay for a lawyer and sue the company for, you know, good and equal wages? And, you know, and if she won her case and she got like higher wages and maybe sort of like, you know, some payment back pay for like all the years that she had been discriminated against, the solution was an individual one as well. Sort of like it didn't affect, it only helped that one worker. It didn't help anyone else in the company who was being paid less. So by putting this on, by introducing the equal pay standard, we have put this problem where it belongs, and that's on the shoulder of the employer. That like this is a problem not with us who are working, not with our individual workers. It's a problem with the companies and institutions that are discriminating against us, and they should be the ones who actually spend the money to actually fix it, and they should be the ones to have to sort of like make sure that they are not discriminating and getting us people against people. And so this is actually sort of like incredibly exciting, the equal pay standard. And yeah, actually, though I hate the logo, that's sort of like a company that achieves a certification gets this logo, and I'm like, yeah, but it's sort of like, I mean, one really exciting thing is that sort of like the equal pay standard so far is only written in, it's been translated into English, and you can actually, it's unfortunately it's not available for free, but it costs, I think, it's less than 100 euros to buy, and it's been translating, so you can see how the system works. And like, and I every time I go talk to people who are from abroad, I tell them about the equal pay standard because I feel it's so exciting. It's such a new potent tool to fight against pay discrimination in our society, because in the end, our standard was written to international standards, like it's a part of an international standard system. So it basically means that any country could actually go and take a standard like this and adapt it for use in their own labor market and introduce it. And it doesn't have to be mandatory. It can be voluntary. Like a standard like this is supposed to work. For example, you know, when you go to the store and you think about, okay, you know, I'm going to, you know, I only want to buy organic food, and you check out the labels, and then you buy the ones that are stamped organic, and you only want to buy, for example, fair trade coffee because you don't want to discriminate against sort of like, or you don't want to sort of like, you want to buy coffee from people who treat their farmers well, so you buy, you know, fair trade. So this adds a new one, equal pay. This gives sort of like a consumer the opportunity to sort of like, you know, to vote with their, you know, wallet to sort of like only buy products and services from companies that have implemented an equal pay standard. So it doesn't have to be like it here in Iceland. It doesn't have to be mandatory. Just by adding this tool to sort of like the toolkit in a country is immeasurably helpful, in my opinion. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Why is this here? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think. Yeah, I think I want to maybe just point out here, this is a labor force participation in Iceland. This also, I guess, you see it's incredibly high. And since the 1990s, it's been fairly equal. Like, you know, we have around 80% of women who are in the workplace and around 80% of men who are in the workplace. And this has been equal for now since the 90s, and the reason the change happened in the 90s is that that's when we got universal daycare, and universal daycare, which, by the way, was introduced by the first woman mayor in Reykjavik. So again, daycare wasn't an issue for a male parliament, and it wasn't an issue for like a male city government. But as soon as a woman who was actually a part of the Women's Alliance, the Feminist Party, she became mayor, and this was the thing that she did. She introduced like Reykjavik is going to offer universal daycare for everyone over the age of 2, and after that, like Reykjavik did it, every other city in Iceland had to do it. So, but as soon as that happened, sort of like we can see that women went to the workplace, and this sort of like, and yeah, here I have a slide of, yeah, again, this doesn't really, you know, doesn't really go. I'm just going to jump over this. Paternity and maternity leave, also incredibly important. We now have independent entitlement to leave for parents for up to 6 months, and this is and what happened. This is an incredibly important philosophical shift that happened just last year in Iceland. Before that time, we had legislation that tied, it was basically with 3 divisions. So you had 4 months tied to each parent, and then 2 months to share. So you have, so you had sort of like, each parent, mother and the father most usually, but sometimes mother and mother, or father would get, 4 months each, and then you had 2 months to share. And but it turns out that, not obviously, but it turns out that when you looked at the figures, men were only taking 1% of that shared leave. So what happened with the new legislation that was passed last year was that they just changed the wording and the philosophical underpinnings, and it basically just says, like, there's only 2 divisions. 6 months is tied to each parent, and a person who wants to give, a person is allowed to give away up to 6 weeks of that entitlement to the other parent, but it has to be sort of like, they have to actually do it proactively. They have to go and say, I'm going to give up my rights to this, so and I give that to this other person. So it's sort of like, it's a philosophical change, and we're actually hoping that sort of like it spurs more men to be willing to stay their whole share of the leave at home. Because sort of like, we all know that sort of like, we know that men in Iceland want the right to stay with their children. They love that right. They use that right. Like ever since parental leave for fathers was introduced in 2000, around 90% of men have taken their leave. So we're hoping that this encourages men to take equal part in the parental leave, because it does make a difference. Because women in the workplace is the underpinnings. Like, if women are not financially independent, you can't have women's liberation. It's just as simple as that. Yeah. See here. So here is the fathers taking paternity leave, and you can actually see we don't have any more recent figures since 2017, but there was a concerning drop at that time, but it's still, it's still around 80%. I'm gonna get my second cup of coffee here. Just very, very quickly, I'm sure if you were attending Feminist Fjármál's talk, they talked about the gender income inequality, so I'm not going to go really into it. I just want to include this because I think it's such a telling statement, sort of like, of where we are as a society. And it's just how economists and people who have like lots of specialized knowledge can basically erase gender inequality. So if you look at the largest figure here, the income gap between women and men, that's basically sort of like looking at the pay gap on a monthly basis. So if you just look at sort of like the average pay of women in Iceland versus the average pay of men in Iceland on a monthly basis, this is a difference, 25.5%. It's huge. But when people usually talk about the gender pay gap, they're talking about the gender pay gap on an hourly basis, when it becomes much lower, because what is happening there obviously is that women work more part-time than men. And it's not because women are lazy, it's because women are doing all this unpaid labor in the workplace, no, in the home. And so they're doing all this work. So it's so we feel sort of like, that we feel that the only true way to measure the gender pay gap or the income gap is to focus on the monthly wages. But so the yellow figure is the Icelandic number, the gender pay gap on an hourly basis, and it's called here unadjusted. That means it's just sort of like, that means it's just sort of like when you look at the average hourly wages of women versus the average hourly wages of men. And then you have something, and this becomes, you can only laugh, because if you don't laugh, you cry. 4.3%, that's the adjusted gender pay gap in Iceland. It's sort of like, you go like, hey, what? There is income equality in Iceland? Like, there's no a gender pay gap. Adjusted gender pay gap basically means that economists go and look at the hourly figure between women and men, and they go like, oh, we need to adjust this and sort of like make sure that sort of like we just other factors into it. So for example, these percentages of women are actually working in the care sector, and the figures of and the wages in the care sector are like 30% lower than in construction work. So we're going just to erase that difference because it's just a labor market issue. And and of course we don't think it's a labor market issue. It's a feminist issue. It's an inequality issue that the care work sector is being paid less money for their work than the construction issue. And they look at the figures and go like, oh, so much, a big part of the reason we have this gender pay gap is that, so many men are working bonus hours, like they're working at night or they're working overtime, while women are not. And we look, and so that's why we're going to erase that part of the gender pay gap and just say sort of like, and lower the gender pay gap. And again, we go, no, this is not a reason to lower the pay gap. Like the only reason men are working more overtime or getting more bonus payment is because, women have to leave work early to take care of the children. So again, the issue is gender inequality. So, but it's an example sort of like of how economists can just erase the inequality within our society using these statistics, and many people just don't notice because it's incredibly complicated to talk about, like economics and economic formulae. But again, and then of course, like in the end, why are we debating even about sort of like the hourly wages of women versus men? In my opinion, in the opinion of most of us here in the I think all of us here in the feminist movement in Iceland, the only true figure we should be looking at is the income gap itself. Like this is really it. Like this is the amount of women you are getting in your bank account every month. And today, the difference between the average income, like average check that comes in your bank account between women and men in Iceland is 25.5%, and that's just absolutely unacceptable. There we go. Okay, yay, I'm coming to an end. No progress without grassroots organization. And so I think, as I've talked a lot in this, like in the past 45 minutes about it, is that it's sort of like the only reason we are here today, and the only reason sort of like I've been able to talk about all these solutions and all these tools that we have implemented here in Iceland is because we've had women in parliament to put this on the agenda and to make the change. And the only reason women in parliament are in parliament is because of the work of the feminist movement in Iceland. So we've gone on strike 6 times. Since the first one in 75, and again in 85, then 2005, 2010, 2016, and 2018. The 2018 one, you can see this is like we called that our Me Too strike. Like we decided, like we don't call a strike or a protest every year because like it would lose its effect. We call it when it's necessary, and it was necessary in 2008 because of the Me Too stories that are being shared about violence in the workplace. We wanted to sort of like, this is unacceptable. Like it's not enough to sort of like focus on the pay inequality. We need to focus on women's safety, like the equal access to the workplace, and we don't have equal access to the workplace if women have to fear for their safety in the workplace because of harassment and violence. And we had this slogan, "Don't change women, change the world." Like it's not women's problem, it's a social problem, it's the company problem. It's like not, we aren't the ones who should be sort of like worrying about changing our behavior or the way we work to avoid certain people. It's the responsibility of our workplace to create a safe environment, and it's responsibility of a society to again create a safe environment, so for us to work in free from violence. And I think sort of like and it's important that again, when organizing mass protests, they are important to sort of like to get the point across to and to start the conversation in the whole society. It does show the people in power that you want change and are willing to sort of like go out and work for change. But again, this is something I think many people often think that's sort of like, oh, this is what women in Iceland do every year. We go out on a strike, but we don't. It's a more sort of like, it's a tool that sort of like we bring out when it's like the big guns. We bring it out when necessary. Again, I want to add by complicating the situation again with the violence. These are figures that are just now coming out. The University of Iceland is doing this huge study on women and trauma and the effect of trauma in women. And they basically contacted every woman above the age of 16 in Iceland and asked them to answer a very detailed survey. Like it took about an hour and a half to answer. Like I answered it, it took about an hour and a half, and it was a detailed survey about their experiences of trauma and experience, for example, of violence. And so, like if they had been, you know, if they had been suffered violence in their lifetime. And they managed to get around 20% of the adult women population in Iceland to answer. So which means that sort of like with 20%, like you can be fairly sure that this is a representative figure for the whole country. And 33% of the women in Iceland, you know, they reported having been sexually harassed or sexually assaulted at work or in school. This is what we talk about often is sort of like now as Me Too. 25% of women in Iceland have been sexually assaulted and 25% have been physically assaulted, which is just, these numbers are just unimaginable, right? Like you look at these numbers and you go like, this is, you know, this is, it's normalized. Violence in women is normalized. Like you don't have 25% of women going to the police and, you know, reporting being raped or reporting being assaulted. These are the numbers you get when you actually call women and ask them what has happened to you. And I'm also going to say, and I'm fairly confident that Iceland is not a more violent country than other countries, that if we're getting these numbers here in Iceland when we're calling women and asking them about violence, these are the numbers you're going to get also in other countries. Because, you know, when we look at the numbers of, again, reported rapes and assaults in all of our countries, they're much lower than this. Yeah, and you can see here, like these are just again, this is just also again a fact of where we live as a system, that we are still living in a patriarchal system. This is from 2008 to 2009. It's fairly old, but I use it because that's the sort of like a report came out that sort of like looked at all the cases of sexual violence that was reported to the police during those 2 years. And they found that there were 189 cases of sexual violence that were reported. And the scholar, she basically followed like what happened to these cases. And so as she says, sort of like 88% of these cases, or like 88 of these 189 cases, that's less than 50%, were referred to the state prosecutor. The other cases were just dropped by the police. The prosecutor issued 31 charges, you know, out of 189 against individuals, and of whom 23 were convicted. So you see the conviction rate is incredibly low out of cases of sexual violence. And during the same period, the Rape Crisis Center in the hospital, like the biggest hospital in Iceland, they, you know, reported 248 visits of victims of sexual violence. And individuals sought counseling regarding 463 new cases of CMOTs during the same period. And again, I emphasize these are just the reported cases. As we then see now, 2 years ago, so 10 years following this report, the vast majority of women don't bother to report. They don't bother going to seek for help. So, but again, 23 convictions out of 189 reported cases, just horrific. And of course, when I add this sort of like the final figure, because it's just so ridiculous, like the official capacity of the prison system in Iceland is 172. So you can imagine, if sort of like we would take sort of like, or even just the reported cases of sexual violence in Iceland, and, you know, we would actually get convictions in these cases. You would break the prison system. We would need to build 4 new prisons to sort of like to sustain all of this. Is just, you know, we're at the very beginning of talking about violence in Iceland as we're elsewhere. We've come much further in combating inequalities in the workplace, inequalities in the pay system, because it's easy to talk about this issue, but talking about violence is hard. It's hard to discuss. It's hard to think about the perpetrators. It's hard to think about for women also, because we are also related to perpetrators of sexual violence, like but this is a conversation that we need to have as a society, because we need to create a society where women and men and everyone can live free of violence. And finally, again, equality in Iceland, we now have 20% of our population is immigrant. We are still very lacking in immigrant representation in all levels of power. There is So we need to make sure sort of like that everything that we are doing as feminists is that I'm continually aware of my privilege that, you know, as a white woman, as a native born Icelander who speaks fluent Icelandic, as an educated woman who speaks fluent English, it sort of like makes it very easy for me to talk about feminism, to advocate for feminism. However, sort of like I cannot sort of like speak for everyone else. We are trying to include in our work as an association the work of marginalized people in Iceland, so like the work of immigrants who come to our country with different experiences and different ideas, and sometimes and many times these ideas also enrich our ideas of sort of like what it means to be equal. So I think sort of like this.
By the way, I just wanted to say I will gladly just give you a few more minutes to wrap it up, so we could also have.
Oh yeah, I think this is my last slide. So because my last slide is ending up on intersection, because I do feel that this is sort of like the important issue that we need to talk about, or like when we think about the future, is to create to make sure that we are all intersectional and inclusive. That's sort of like and we've in our organization sort of like what we've tried to do, because again you've heard me talking about rules and regulations and sort of like creating the framework to make sure inequality doesn't happen. What we did was that we changed our mission statement. So if you go on the line to check out our organization, see our mission statement, it basically says that sort of like we are like inclusive, and we do not practice discrimination, and we are continually aware that our idea of equality is bound in time and will change, that sort of like people will come after us who have a very different idea about equality, and we need to be open to this. So we wanted to enshrine within our sort of like the way we work and we think about sort of like women's rights and feminism, that we are always open to sort of like, you know, getting new ideas about sort of like and facing the fact that sometimes we as well discriminate, and we as well are not inclusive, and so we need to sort of like work on that to be good feminists. So again, support a strong and vibrant feminist movement. Thank you. All right.
Lovely.
You're fantastic. I turned off the slides because I've been talking into the void. I couldn't actually see anyone except, you know, my slides. So I'm like, all right.
Mm-hmm. That was fantastic. Thank you. We're doing a little clap from our office aside. We have a few questions up here already, and I'm going to get to those in a moment as well, both Lily, Sarah, and Laura. I'm also going to do a little stretch. I invite all of you to do the same, and if you have some water or coffee or tea with you, then engage and have some of that. If I may, Brynhildur, to ask you, I can start perhaps off of a slightly more personal ground. May I? Lovely. So you started the presentation by saying that you have been engaged in intense work on feminist and gender-related issues for 25 years, which is mad. Quarter of a century. Yeah. You know, let's just like take a moment to sit with that. That is a long time. And another kind of moment from your presentation was about this switch from an ironic postmodern feminist into a power-hungry feminist. And I wanted to ask if you could tell us a story of a light bulb going off in your head, whether it was at the very beginning of your feminist story or within that switch that you described. I would love to hear a story from your life from those 25 years.
Yeah, no, it's I think, I mean, it was at the moment, I mean, in 2000, it was in, I'm not sure, like, I'm not sure how it was in your country, but sort of like the financial crash here in Iceland was devastating. It's just this uncertainty, and especially for my generation, I mean, I was turning 30 the year the crash happened. Sort of like I was supposed to sort of like, you know, be starting work, buying, you know, a house, starting my work, and it sort of like it really put my life on hold for 7 years. So for us, sort of like the people who were born around 1980, it was, you know, it really sort of like put sort of like all of our careers at a hold. And I remember, and it was just, and it was really hard for me personally as well, because I was living in New York at the time. So I didn't really know what was going on. And I was just watching the international news media that kept going like, oh, people are burning their Rolls Royces in the streets of Reykjavik. And I was like, what the hell? It's like, it's a hellscape in this tiny country. What's going on? And And then, you know, for the first time, you know, I became, and I think sort of like this happened for a lot of the generations sort of like that survived the crash in 2000, survived the crash, that's lived through the crash in 2009. We became much more politically active. I mean, I watched election returns for the first time in 10 years since I moved away from the country. And, you know, and in fact, it really was this moment when I realized women had broken the glass ceiling. It was just so shocking to me because nobody was talking about women in parliament, nobody at all. So like you were watching, like we had like all the Icelanders in, not all the Icelanders, like Icelanders in New York had sort of like created like a watching party, and we were watching this together. And you know, with I don't know if you've seen my, oh, actually I don't have my last name, but sort of like it's fairly easy in most cases to tell the gender of a man or a woman, because men are like the son of somebody and women are the daughters of somebody. And actually now since 2020, if you're gender nonconformist, you're burr of somebody. So so it's fairly easy to sort of like your gender is encoded in your name in most cases. And I was just looking at the computer screen, watching this online, and I was just counting the daughters and going like, wait, can this be right? And then you're like picking up my calculator because I'm studying literature. I don't know how to do this stuff in my head, going like, oh my God, we fucking broke the glass. Like, and we didn't even break it, like we smashed it. Like I at the time I thought 38 was, you know, a huge victory. Now I know better 12 years later. Now I know that 38% is horrible. Like we are to put it at 50, like, you know, but again, it was just this sort of like shifting of my dreams that was just so important. And I think sort of like, I think a lot of people in Iceland became, and especially the young generation, is sort of like, and it's the generation that follows me, the generation who was born in 1990 to 2002 is really going to change the world. They became incredibly politically aware because they were children and they were young teenagers living in through the crash. They were living through they became intensely active in politics, intensely active in social activism for progressive causes. And so that helped, but I think sort of like, I think I also want to emphasize when I became active 25 years ago, I'm now 43. That was, yeah, I was 18. I was in high school. I joined my first feminist club. At that time, feminism in Iceland was a curse word. Like you couldn't use the word feminism. Like all these legislation that you see here, and I know sort of like in many cases when I talk about what we're doing here in Iceland to people from abroad, they look at me like I'm from Mars. Like what the hell's going on? Like this is just like a crazy. Like we're never going to be able to get that passed here. This is, I just want to emphasize, this has happened in the last 15 years. Like once change happens, it happens incredibly quickly. Like, you know, and the more change, like, and the more you change, the quicker the changes become, right? Like it becomes a ball that starts rolling. And so, I mean, so I moved from like, you know, when I was 18, I was joining okay, it's not an, it was an underground, like we called it, like we were the first organization that actually used the word feminist in the name of our organization because it was such a bad word. We caused great controversy and we were like, you know, considered very radical. And, you know, now you have feminist clubs that are in every single high school in the country. It's become normalized. Like, you know, everyone is feminist now. Like men are feminist now. Women in parliament are feminist now. It's like we've managed to change the culture, and it happened incredibly quickly because, again, once change started happening, it happened, like it kept on happening and it happened quicker. And so, and again, so like, again, power hungry, I say it's because we're getting women elected. So if there's one thing.
Thank you. One of the things that you mentioned is the importance of organizatorial skills when it comes to getting more women and people with marginalized identities into power. Can you be a little more specific about what organizatorial skills mean? You know, what subsets of abilities and skills should people develop in order to be able to affect change?
Yeah, it's like, I really think sort of like, I think activism should really just be taught as a course at the university, or like nothing with the university, just like it should be taught at the course for everyone. You know, you don't need to have a high school degree to learn it. Like really, it's I mean, just think about it. I've personally been involved in organizing 2 strikes and organizing, and it was not such a massive organization as they were doing in the 1975 when they were talking to everyone. I had it easy because I basically inherited like a, you know, a branding or a logo. People knew what the women's strike was. But you know, it was an intense learning curve just to organize, and I was just organizing one single protest, but it's just sort of like the practicalities of living in a society. You need to know sort of like where you get the permits from, like whom do you contact, sort of like we don't need permits to protest, but we do have to let the police know that we're doing this. And if we want to close the street at some point, sort of like you will have to actually find money to pay for closing the streets. You need to find money to pay for the staging, for the sound system. You know, you need to find money to pay for accessibility, because we need to make sure sort of like that people in wheelchairs can you know, actually attend and sort of like, you know, be a part of this, and all this requires time and effort and knowledge, and time and effort and knowledge that well, I'm not going to say that we had, but sort of like we managed to get it done. And one of the reasons we managed to get it done was because of cooperation. An organization like mine could never call a strike on its own. You need to have the conversation with everyone before. And when I say with everyone, with the wide breadth of women's groups and labor unions in the country, so to make sure, like, you know, is this something we want to do? Is this something we should do? Sort of like, so you need to get to sort of like the efforts. You need to get sort of like everyone involved in advocating for and organizing, and, you know, giving money to organize a strike. Like, you know, all of this takes time, effort, and money. And yeah, and I mean, people often find it difficult to talk about money. And I work for a feminist organization, and we can only afford to have one staff member, and that's me. And we count ourselves lucky because, you know, feminist groups in Iceland, they don't have money to have staff members. Only me, like only our organizations. And
yeah.
And so we've been advocating for many years now that sort of like our government should be passing a law that mandates financial support of feminist organizations, because, you know, we know that money makes all the difference. Like if our organizations did not have me working full time doing what I'm doing, like we would be doing so very little, right? Like, you know, you can only do so much in volunteer work. You can only do so much focusing on the passion of women who have to work full time to actually care for their families, and, you know, have to also have like their free time. So to be able to do effective feminist work, you need to be able to pay people to do it. And really, we've been worrying about democracy in the West for, you know, 10 years now, and there is a reason to worry. There is a rising liberalism in our societies. The cheapest way for a government to ensure democracy is to provide stipends, and, you know, generous stipends to organizations that are human rights defenders, like feminist organizations. It's absolutely the cheapest way, because we do know that when they give money to us, sort of like, we can make it stretch, because we bring out us as an organization, we get enough money to pay for one person, me, but I'm the sort of like contact person that sort of like then gets all the other people who are not getting paid for the work excited about the work and willing to organize, and, you know, willing to give just a little bit extra more to sort of like organize things like a feminist forum. So money is necessary. Power and money, like that's the, I think so, like that's the
at the last presentation that we had with Feminist Forum, that follow the money was one of the things that we also left up with, and fundraising as an essential skill of effective activism. That's also, I think, something that we'll take from here. I also wanted to ask about coalition building and communication strategy. So in your practice, have you seen effective communication strategies that instead of, let's say, communicating to a very narrow, already feminist-minded audience, is able to build broader coalitions that are interested in human rights more broadly? Or let's say, if I were to ask that a little more simply, what kinds of communication strategies in your experience work and which don't?
I'm a very, very practically minded person, and you know what? So long as the end results is okay, I don't actually care, you know, what they're called. So I mean, it's just like a very simple fact about, okay, just take the women's strike in Iceland, for example. Like, we call it the women's strike in English, but it's not really the women's strike. In Icelandic, it's called kvennafrí, which means women's free time or women's day off. And the reason it's called that is that because in 1974, when all these women from varying organizations came together, they were thinking about, okay, so in 1975, it was the UN Year of the Women. They wanted to do something big, didn't really know what to do. And then one of the left-wing groups, communist groups, they came up with the idea, you know what, let's have a strike. we will strike for women's rights. And all the other organizations, including mine, which was, fairly, which was very bourgeois at the time, they were like, no, we're not going on a strike. That's so leftist. We would never do that. Like, that's horrible. So this idea would have died, except sort of like then one woman just, thought about it for a moment and said, okay, I agree, we shouldn't have a strike, but why don't we take a day off? Like to symbolize or like to highlight our importance to society, and they did, and it worked. Like effectively, it was a strike, but it's not known as a strike. It's known as Kvennafri, or Women's Day Off. And so so that's why I think sort of like effective strategies to sort of like we need to find a way to again sell gender equality and feminism to people who are disagree with us, and if we can't reach them, we're not going to get very far. Like we need to be able to sort of like translate the ideology of feminism and the importance of feminism and gender equality into terms that sort of like people who are different from us politically would agree. We as an organization, again, we are incredibly old. We were founded in 1907, so we've gone through a lot for the past century, just over a century, and women recognize this. In 1940, they changed the bylaws of our organization to basically mandate that women who were active in all political parties in parliament needed to be a part of the board. And this was to make sure that we didn't become a completely leftist organization or a completely right-wing organization, that we remained trans-political. And so we had a voice in every party, no matter how socially conservative. And they also had a voice in how we worked. And this has sort of like been also one of the reasons why we still exist today, is because we never got sucked into any sort of like political infighting that often happens either on the right or the left. So like we remain, because we speak with everyone, and it does give us also a certain gravitas. It makes us in some cases not as radical as others. It makes us move slower, but it's sort of like when we do change, it like the change is sustainable, and it's sort of like it helps drive the conversation. So and you know what, I do think it has had a practical effect in Iceland. For example, when you by involving women, again, also men, but it's mostly women who are interested, political women in all parties, into sort of like feminist work. It means that sort of like you have good ideas that are coming from from places that you would maybe not expect. So if we look at in Iceland, the first parental leave, the first equal parental leave in 2000, that came from a center-right party. The idea and the proposal and the push and the legislation to make the equal pay standard mandatory, that came from a right party as well. That came from a financially like libertarian right-wing party. And it's so you have sort of like parties on both sides of the aisle here in Iceland, sort of like adding to the mosaic, because we managed to create. We managed at some point. I don't have the magic solution. I don't know how it happened, but we managed to create a society where it became a part of something that everyone agrees on, that this is important.
I would actually kind of use that as the perfect moment, because we are going to wrap up. I hope it's okay, Brynhildur, if we take, let's say, 5 more minutes or so of your time. So Lily asks about the most recent changes, that 2021 updated gender equality law. What did that include? What changed with that piece of legislation?
The most important changes is that it added intersectionality for the first time into the Gender Equality Act. It still focuses on gender, but intersectionality is now sort of like considered a part of the act. Also, a very important change would be the insertion of the third gender, because we now have 3 legally recognized genders in Iceland, and we didn't have that before that. So it was incredibly important. Aside from that, sort of like it was just fine-tuning the tools that we already had. It was because we already have fantastic, but sort of like it was just making sure that the sort of like bureaucracy of feminism, the femocracy of our country became sort of like more effective. So, but the biggest changes was the adding of intersectionality to and protection and sort of like gender neutral people to the act.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. So before we close off, Nella will have a piece to say of her own. And before we go there, what I would like to ask everyone that's here and has been listening to Brynhildur's presentation about, the past and the present of Icelandic situation with regards to gender issues, I have 2 questions for you. Okay, everyone. So another deep breath. So please, in the chat here, my first question is, on a scale of 1 to 5, how possible or how feasible do you feel like some of those positive changes would be? Let's say, how feasible would it be for those to also take place in your country in the coming 10 years on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being absolutely impossible, 5 being very possible? How possible do you see the changes that Brynhildur told us about in Iceland being in your country? So share that here, just put that out there, and we can kind of see where we are with regards to our cynicism or our sense of possibility in the coming 5 to 10 years, or 10 years exactly. Sorry, that's what I said. That's me. A little moment of active thinking, of imagination, I think is good to kind of engage our own brains and get something out here. And the second thing that I would like you to do also in the chat box here is to write if there was one change that Brynhildur described here in her presentation, whether it's from 100 years ago when she first got started to the present day, the legislation from 2021 that we were just told about. What would you like to see happen, take place, or change in your country? What's the main sort of like legislative power-hungry feminist embodying change that you would like to see brought into effect? If you write that here, you'll have exercised the power of your voice, and then next time someone has a conversation with you about your feminist beliefs, you'll be able to say, I want there to be no gender roles, but I also have this like specific legislative idea. So let's just share one idea that Brynhildur's presentation gave us that you would like to see enacted in your country. I'll do the same, and so will Nella. What was Brynhildur, sorry, what was it called? The really advanced gender pay gap legislation that had a really expensive...
The equal pay standard.
Yes, equal pay standard, exactly.
Can I also then give my answer?
Yes, please.
Shall I add it into the box, or should I use the power of the microphone?
Use the power of the microphone.
I will use the power of the microphone, but I again, I encourage you. We are all here on an equal basis. So what I say is no more valid than us. In my opinion, the most important change that we've made in the past 25 years is daycare, universal and affordable daycare. And I kind of skipped over it because frankly I was getting hoarse, but I skipped over it in the talk. But we can see sort of like the number of women just jumps up as soon as you have daycare, and it's all about the money. Like, if women don't have money, if we don't have financial independence, we will never become liberated. And so, so it's universal daycare. To have access to that is sort of like, it's the foundation for every other change necessary. It's a foundation also in a way for women in politics as well. But again, it's sort of like, who comes first, chicken the egg? It took a woman in politics to actually make sure that we got universal and affordable daycare. So those two, I kind of.
Beautiful, thank you. Feel free to still keep sharing your answers here. From my end, I would just like to deeply thank Brynhildur for taking us through this journey. It's inspiring and strange, and let's say cynicism erasing to hear the process that Iceland has gone through. There's definitely some disbelief that needs to be suspended in the backs of our brains. A sense of possibility is not something that we have because everything is great around us. A sense of possibility is something that we need to cultivate daily in order to survive within a patriarchal society, and that look into what the possibility could mean physically and realistically, something that you offered for us today. So I really appreciate that, time and your voice and your story here. From my end, I would just like to conclude TALFF, and Nela will have some closing words. Thank you everyone for your attention and for your presence. I really, really appreciate that.